this was a really interesting piece because it pits a more conservative kind of Democratic coalition versus a more liberal, at least nominally, kind of and in many ways, Democratic incumbent who's, I believe, being term limited out, but that kind of still coalition as well, and unions within Texas and within Houston, and they're kind of more aligned with the conservative front runner here, which is something that you wouldn't expect from the outside, but your piece does a great job of kind of fleshing it out. But let's just, I guess, start from the beginning about who the players are here for our audience. The current mayor of Houston and the conservative Democrat who is the front runner to become the mayor after him. Who are these guys?
Okay, so I think it's helpful to start first with John Whitmire. He has been in the state legislature since around 1972. He actually won his first election when he was in college still. And he stayed in the sort of state, as a representative for around a decade before making the jump to the Senate, where he has stayed since 82. So, going on 40 years now. He's the dean of the Senate. He sort of ran as a more, I believe, progressive candidate at the time, way back when. But he was a very ineffective legislator. Texas Monthly actually, when he sort of came around the curve in the 90s, said that, before then he'd just kind of been a class clown. And it wasn't until 1993 when he rewrote, pretty much completely overhauled the penal code, the prison system, essentially, when he really became sort of a household name, like the dean of the Senate, which is in itself a kind of interesting way of thinking about the trajectory of the Texas Democratic Party. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, but Theodore Roosevelt had, a 4-to-1, support among people of Texas in a couple of his runs. There was very strong support for him in the party, a lot of union support, and there was a lot of union activity in Texas. But that sort of gave way after the 60s, and the sort of rise of, I'm sure your viewers are aware of neoliberalism and the sort of austerity politics that took hold around then. But Democrats held the majority in Texas from the Civil War basically all the way up to the 90s, which is a very long time, but it led to a crisis in the party because they didn't really know where to turn after the New Deal era kind of collapsed in on itself. So Whitmire and other Democrats sort of staked their claim on along similar lines as Bill Clinton, as sort of tough on crime, punitive politicians. And that's exactly what Whitmire did. When he rewrote the penal code in 1993, you can look at it at the Prison Policy Institute. There's like a graph from the 80s up into, where we are now. In 1993, it's almost a straight line. The prison population more than doubled in just 5 years.
Wow.
And he did that by making more, making sure that violent criminals had to serve at least 50% of their sentence before they were eligible for any kind of parole, and totally removed good behavior from nonviolent offender crimes. So, if you're in prison and you were caught with, weed or something like that, you could be held in prison for, however long, no matter how good you were in prison, no matter, what was going on there. But that didn't really work. The sort of rightward tack that the party took still led to the rise of the Republican Party. But because of his sort of tough on crime credentials, he has sort of maintained his status. I'll get back to sort of the rest of that story, how he's pivoted later. But Mayor Turner was also in the state legislature for a long time before he sort of came back to Houston and ran for the mayoral spot. At the time, you can look back at a lot of the coverage then and see that he was sort of uh, marketed as this working. He was originally working class. He was from the Acre Homes neighborhood, which is like a poor sort of black part of town, and they marketed him as a working class progressive, which when you hear that, you think, maybe he would be able to sort of implement some good stuff. And his record has shown, I think it's fair to say, kind of the opposite of that. He has sort of maintained the status quo, the sort of new Democrat line after Bill Clinton, say, and a lot of progressives were disappointed with him. He sort of lagged on workers' protections. He did. He repeatedly, delayed these affordable housing projects. He actually got sued by Obama's Housing and Urban Development
Which is
chair.
interesting because Houston, I believe, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but had received HUD grants to implement that housing first policy that was quite successful for its 10-year run from 2011 to 2021.
Right. That policy is still going. And I actually have another article about that I wrote a while back. It's a successful policy, to be sure. It gets a lot of people housed. What I found through sort of my research is the problem with housing in Texas, just generally, is that there are very few tenant protections. So in Houston, where it's relatively affordable to live, you can sort of, what they do is, they partner with landlords and they're like, hey, if we pay, so and so amount of the rent, like, will you take these, homeless people in? And they do that like all across the city, primarily in poorer parts of town. But what ends up happening is sometimes those landlords are not the best, and they get moved into pretty. Can I swear on the show or?
Yeah, go
pretty,
for it.
Yeah, pretty shitty housing. I talked to this woman who, she moved into this place and there were just rats all over the place. And there was another woman who was in a car wreck before she became homeless, and they put her on a second-story apartment. So it's a mixed bag, but it has been overall successful, I would say. But yeah, he has gotten support for housing first policies and stuff like that. But at the same time, when COVID came around, while other cities like Austin and Dallas were sort of initiating their own eviction moratorium, because in a state like Texas, judges just decided to avoid or, ignore the CDCs, he decided not to. Like, he just waited to see what the state would do, hoping that the state would come in with a moratorium. And if you know anything about Greg Abbott, yeah, exactly. So before he did anything, more than 15,000 people were evicted. I talked to a woman at the time who, she was at work. I don't remember where she was working, but she went to the hospital with COVID and, had the tube on and everything. And when she came back home, she's walking home from the hospital finally, and there's an eviction notice on her door. And it was just stuff like that over and over again. So that felt like a failure to a lot of progressives. You'll notice that like a lot of the unions that endorsed him in 2015 when he initially ran did not endorse him in 2019 because it felt like a betrayal.